along with many of the people here, I believe that it's possible that with technology we can, in the fairly near future, create or become creatures that surpass humans in every aspect of intelligence. I don't think this is quite certain, although if it can happen, I think the only thing that could stop it would be an extreme physical catastrophe, which we science fiction writers actually use occasionally when we want to avoid talking about the technological singularity. Because I like to say that science fiction writers were the first career group that was impacted by the singularity, whether or not the singularity actually happens, because we have readers who think the singularity is very likely. And if we're trying to write science fiction that alleges to be realistic, if we don't have the singularity in it, then we're in kind of in trouble with those readers. And frankly, it's sort of hard to write about stories after the singularity, because if the top players are superhumanly intelligent, then there's a lot of stuff that's not understandable anymore to normal humans such as this writer or the readers or contemporary readers of science fiction. So this is a technological development that is qualitatively different than technological developments in the past. I don't think that undermines the notion of meeting like this and having a Singularity University, as long as it's kind of kept in mind that we're talking about navigating the time up to the point where people of normal intelligence are not in a position to do much navigation. I actually think that there's a number of different ways that we could get to the singularity. And in fact, this increases my feeling that it's actually pretty likely. I suspect that all of these ways are going to happen, and that raises some very interesting questions about which ways you want to have happen and what would be the fate of a way to the singularity that was not the first to reach superhuman intelligence levels. But let me just talk briefly about these. Artificial intelligence, a pure computer sitting somewhere that we figured out how to program or to teach to be superhumanly intelligent. In a way, that may be the first that pops to mind when people think about the singularity. Now, some people who are optimistic talk about, well, we'll just upload human minds into this super smart computer and that way achieve all sorts of things like immortality and also becoming very smart. So, depending on where you're at, you might regard that outcome as especially scary or fairly benign. The second bullet on my list there is intelligence amplification that Brad mentioned, the notion of using the computer as what David Brin calls a neocortex. And David goes on to say that the machine part allows us to be very, very smart, and the human part supplies the component that we humans are especially good at, and that is wanting things. I would say that most people who think about the singularity and are apprehensive about it and say and do not think that uploads are on the immediate horizon, those people often fall into the category of regarding intelligence amplification as the edgewise way of making it all turn into a benign situation. For one thing, if you became smarter, then all this talk about the singularity being unintelligible becomes kind of irrelevant to you. You and all the other people who chose to become a lot smarter would understand what is going on. It would look like progress of the sort that we've enjoyed and had to put up with over the last few centuries. So that actually, I think for many years I regarded that as almost an unalloyed plus, until I ran into a friend of mine who said, Vernor, I think, he said, that the pure machine version of superintelligence would be safer. Because look, we humans have millions and millions of years of bloody baggage about solving problems in very violent ways. And my friend went on to say that, in fact, if we were to make someone superhumanly intelligent, it might be the biggest monster of all. And frankly, he said, there's only one person I would trust to give that sort of power. And that last sentence did not convince me of anything except that he had a point with the rest of what he was talking about. The third bullet, which is actually the thing I want to talk about most today, is computer networks plus humanity achieve superhuman intelligence of at least a functional sort. All of these things, I think, are actually going along quite well, or in fact, proceeding according to a schedule that would get us to the singularity fairly soon. However, in the last 10 years, I would say computer networks plus humanity as a superhumanly a competent entity. That possibility has been proceeding at a much more robust rate than the others, which for the most part are also moving along quite briskly. The fourth one is arguably doing it as well as any of these items, and that is, I call it digital Gaia here, and that's the notion of fine-grained distributed systems or ubiquitous embedded microprocessors that are able to communicate at least with near neighbors. And if you think about having a very large, very, very large number of them, you come upon a world where almost every physical artifact, it may not be superhumanly intelligent, but it knows what it is, has descriptive information on board. It knows where it is, perhaps very accurately knows where it is, and it can communicate with its nearest neighbors, and by extension then using store and forward type techniques, it actually can communicate with any other such device in the world. If we actually seriously get into that situation, then we are in a world where, or a reality where the world itself sort of wakes up. The world becomes its own database. And if you're one of those people who mocks discussion of the singularity by religious analogies like the digital rapture or rapture for the nerds, this particular variety might be mocked also, but the thing you'd be mocking is mysticism that is associated with animism, where there are spirits in the world, and the world has a knowledge and has an understanding of what's going on. This possibility also illustrates one of my fundamental contentions, which is that the singularity brings with it things that are very much not understandable by minds such as ours. And I think the digital Gaia looks plenty alien enough for that. I've been saying scary things about each of these. The scary things about the digital Gaia, of course, is it is so very, very alien. It also raises a scary prospect that it should have a special impact on us now, and that is, in our world, if I take this pen and I let go of it, I think everybody in here has a very high, can give very good prediction about what's going to happen to the pen. In a world where your physical artifacts actually, where for the most part, as smart as I've just described, have sensors and perhaps even have limited effectors aboard them and are coordinating among themselves, in that sort of a world, reality would take on the hard and concrete predictability that we presently associate with financial markets. So that is scary. The fourth one is the one that I think is actually lagging: biomedical, purely biomedical improvements in human intelligence. And there actually may be people here and people who are going to be talking that would dispute my contention that is one that's not going like gangbusters. I do see every so often you will see a journalism article that talks about the fourth one, and if you read it carefully, it looks like they're just talking about somebody reinventing amphetamines. Only this time, it's not going to be a drug problem. Actually, that's happened several times in technological history, and so far, it's not been that true that it doesn't partake of the problems that we already have. But one could imagine biomedical enhancements, say, just simply, there's a lot of people who would kill for just a somewhat better memory. And I think things like better memory I don't see any reason why that will turn out to be at all difficult. Other people, of course, would argue that it doesn't matter if you can get associated interfaces to mechanical memory, which could be much, much more effective. So I think that fifth item there is actually a possibility, but it also reveals a general suspicion or snootiness that I've had about several of these over the years, and that is, it's silly to say this, but really, in this game, biology doesn't have legs. By that I mean that minds on machine substrates, it seems to me, actually win in even the middle term if you're talking about computational competence. And I don't see how in the long run biology can match that. I'll come back to that because I have mellowed on that point a little bit. I think there are several nice things about biology besides the things that we already enjoy. What I want to talk about today, for the most part, is the third item, and it's also the thing that gave me my title. Nowadays, the third item there, computer networks plus humanity, would probably most commonly be called social networks. That's the proper buzzword for it. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, when we were writing about things like this, though, we called them group minds. So I decided to use group minds as the name for the talk. And actually, I think I am going to wind up with a wider spread of undertakings than at least what social networks means nowadays. I want to talk about a taxonomy of group minds. I think there is a real virtue when you're looking at new possibilities for just trying to imagine that you're trying to categorize the different types. And this may be just along certain sort of parameters. And try to imagine as far as you can that these parameters are orthogonal, that is not influencing one another. And as a result, you may end up with all sorts of categories for new objects of the class you're talking about that look like they should be empty or vacuous or unimportant or self-contradictory. But it gives you a bunch of pigeonholes that then you should look at individually. And very often you will find that this is sort of creativity on the cheap. You'll find that when you look at one of these pigeonholes that was generated just by these orthogonal categories that you would come up with, that in fact you have a new idea that you at least, or I at least, have not thought about before. And that's one purpose for doing this. And any time in these categories where we see something that looks like there's no reason, there's no use for it, or it would be impossible, or it's self-contradictory, it's nice to pause for a second and try to think with the eye of a science fiction writer if there's any situation where that might be actually something that is actually just an idea that you haven't thought of before. The first the first quality or character of group mind that I have on my list, not necessarily the most important, these are more or less put down at random, is the origin of the group mind. Was it created top-down or bottom-up? Now, by top-down, I essentially mean all the social networks and group projects that we have nowadays, where you have somebody who decides to sit down and start a company or start a research program and enlist customers, well, first of all, maybe enlist programmers to write programs that customers can use to communicate with one another. That's the way it seems to me that it's done now. The idea of a bottom-up social network would be one where basically there is open hardware and software out there, and putting the pieces together can be done by people who want to social network with other people without any registration process with some central authority. So the bottom-up might be characterized a different way, although this may not be an equivalent characterization, as peer-to-peer with open source, not open source, with free software. Right now, as far as I know, that's an empty category of social networks, although Eben Moglen, who used to be the chief counsel of the Free Software Foundation, actually does have a project for creating the free source hardware for that. It's called Freedom Box. And I suspect that this is a more challenging project than free software was in the 1980s, where it may not have looked easy in the 1980s, but in retrospect, it turned out there was a migration path, ultimately getting us to Linux and the stuff that then could be built on top of that for the free software. In the case of free software and free hardware, or free hardware design for social networks, it's not, to me, it's not at all clear what that path is, and I'm hoping the best for Eben Moglen and other people who want to do this. Most of the people nowadays, especially who talk about social networks, I think have the notion of making an enormous amount of money out of either starting a new social network or doing something that can be run on an existing social network. So the idea that there might be some virtue in the bottom-up approach, which, at least on the face of it, doesn't give anything to the instigators. It certainly sounds like a hard sell to a VC, which and by the same token, probably a hard sell to most of the people here. On the other hand, just as with the virtues that we found with free software, I think actually there are virtues to the bottom-up scheme, and there are a number of categories on this list that I'm going to fly by you that I think may not even be imaginable in the top-down approach, but they would be for the bottom-up, including some objectionable possibilities. The second category that I have here is what is the supporting hardware and software that's necessary. In its simplest form, the hardware that we need, we already see the hardware that we need to run a social network in what most of you have on your desks in several copies. On the other hand, there is actually some hardware that's lurking out there that hasn't really been developed yet that makes some of the projects that I'm talking about here much more doable. They'd almost be empty cases without some inventions. For instance, the wearable computers, ubiquitous sensors and effectors, both of those things that are happening under the other categories of trajectories to the singularity, those actually enable forms of social networking or group minds that would probably be non-existent without those technologies. So there is some hardware for group minds, not magical hardware with brain implants necessarily, but there is some obvious hardware that's going to make group minds and particular social networking projects much more feasible. Novel interface software, I think that's also something that is a category of invention that makes things possible that aren't otherwise possible. In fact, some of the wildest forms of social networks critically depend on what the processing pipeline is that's supplied by the automation that stands behind the social network, or the group mind. It's very easy to talk about social networks such as we have now and just imagine software structures such as we have now to support them. But when you look at particular projects like Duolingo, how many people know about Duolingo? Okay. How about reCAPTCHA? Okay. Both, I think, were spearheaded by the same fellow, Louis Van Ahn, but Duolingo is a group mind project, when that term is not used relative to the project, but for learning a foreign language. And it uses a hierarchy of students, that is, it accepts students at all levels of competence in the foreign language, and it plays them off against one another, and it uses the result of their trial translations in order to translate real text. So the idea here is that the participants learn a foreign language. The participants do not pay for it except by generating all the money that would presumably accrue to somebody producing very good natural language translations of text. And a feature that is true of a lot of these group mind projects is how fast they work. If you go to Duolingo.com and run the little flash, the little YouTube type program that they have there, the claim is made that with a modest number of participants, actually about the number of participants I think they already had in their beta, that if it was working, it could translate all of Wikipedia from English into the English Wikipedia, all of that into Spanish in something like, anybody remember what was 100 hours or something like that? 80 hours?
The guy gave a real good TED Talk about that.
Yes, the TED Talk is very impressive, and in fact, it's so impressive that a skeptical person such as myself is looking at this, and I'm always wary of stepping into a pit, saying, isn't this wonderful? And then finding out there's something about it, that it never got out of beta or something like that. Well, Duolingo came out of beta on the 19th of this month, so that's interesting. Think of what it means if this is, say, half as successful as it's being advertised. It is an incredible thing to imagine, almost a bootstrap thing to imagine humans being able to do. And I think it's a very good example that in order for something this wild to work, you have to have an extraordinary suite of software and an extraordinary pipeline that is running the thing. In a smaller way, you can see this with reCAPTCHA. The pipeline that goes from getting reCAPTCHA from, say, the hundreds or thousands of participating sites that want to use that are willing to use reCAPTCHA, the pipeline from that to proper OCR of the original text, that actually involves some, not to me, it's not as deep and magical as Duolingo, but it involves some really clever work to make it work automatically and routinely. If it does work automatically and routinely, again, there's some numbers that Louis Van Ahn said in his TED Talk about how terribly fast you would rip through all the OCR ambiguities that have been created by the Google scanning of major libraries. So, in a way, this says that we have to get these group minds to work, the really weird and most wonderful of the ideas involve some extraordinary work with software as well as with the humans that are my third bullet there was goal, whether it's narrow focus or broad focus. The narrow focus is with just crowdsourcing, where you have one particular sort of project that you're trying to do, is, I think, understandable to, it's something that's familiar to everybody here. And there's lots of projects that involve it. When I first started looking at this, mainly just reading the popular press and science magazines, some of the crowdsourcing looked sort of frivolous to me until I started looking at the numbers. The numbers, that is the performance that these projects were able to do, first of all, was far faster than the successful ones anyway, far faster than any reasonable person would expect on the projects that were involved. A famous early one was categorizing galactic structure, categorizing galaxies on the basis of thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs from the deep sky surveys that have been done in the last decade. There was an article about this in Sky and Telescope, and I think it said the creators of this put it together, and they were expecting that maybe in a year, the chief of the project, I think, had spent like 6 months doing a little test project where he had manually tried to do all of this. And he estimated that in a year or two, that this group mind effort could actually do the whole corpus. And I think the whole corpus of galaxies had been done within 50 hours, 50 hours, of when they went live with the project. Other projects have been successful in extremely different ways. Enzyme folding with Foldit, which is just a game that a relatively small number of people have played, but played better than the best trained humans and the best then existing algorithms for protein folding. There was another one for ribozyme folding. It was also very successful. So these sorts of things certainly got my attention, and I think they reveal that crowdsourcing is something that, although it's very narrow, it's something that can have a lot of effect. Of course, broad focusing is something that we already are familiar with, and I think it's the usual sort of notion that we have when we talk about a social network. However, the bottom-up version of a broad-focused one could be quite interesting. For instance, you could imagine a bottom-up, broadly focused social network would be one where you're tracking the same sort of things that the top-down advertising people like to track, but the demand is bottom-up, and the marketing is bottom-up. So basically, you have destroyed the advertising industry, just sort of invisibly, with these groups that are operating on a scale where they can make purchases in the millions and hundreds of millions, and they don't need the structure of a conscious and self-aware set of advertising executives. Now, whether that is a good thing or a bad thing kind of depends on who you are. In the present era, we all seem to be involved in the Red Queen's race. Like myself as a writer, I'm up against ebooks and I'm up against all the piracy and all this. I'm racing as fast as I can, and if I hadn't actually written and had some success in the past, it would be, of course, much worse for me to be in this sort of steam turbine that's called modern progress. And so when I realize that, I don't feel, when I talk about it happening to some other job category, I don't feel quite so tragedy struck about their plight. We're kind of all in this, up against a situation of terribly disruptive, not destructive, but disruptive new technologies. And a bottom-up, broadly focused social network would probably be of that category. How members are persuaded to participate. You could actually make a long list, and a long list has already been, long list of things have already been used. In fact, Wikipedia has, I believe, a very long list of crowdsourcing, at least, things, and it'd be interesting to look at those, especially if you, like me, have this thing about not wanting to go overboard on something that just has a few outlying successes. It'd be interesting to look at the Wikipedia list and estimate for yourself what percentage of these you think have the sort of success potential of as the crowdsourcing that I've been talking about. But the sort of motivations that are obvious is to make the thing a game. I believe Fold it was presented as a game or a contest. Another is the one that's often used with health maintenance, and that is provoke this insane interest in optimization that consumes Prius drivers who want to get the best miles per gallon out of their machine. Just give them a little display that shows what's happening with their behavior now in whatever it is, health, medical, or getting the best mileage they can on their Prius. Getting prestige is certainly something that's behind some of the contests for doing things. Getting access to data, well, that's what reCAPTCHA. That's the motivation in reCAPTCHA. You want to be able to log in. Learning a language, that's Duolingo. Now that's one that is not obvious at all how you'd make that work. And then I think there's the most obvious of all, although I don't think it's tossed up into the air very often, and that is money. Pay people money to do some sort of group activity, and that's so 20th century. On the other hand, it also may give a clue as something very important that is happening. In other words, what comes after telecommuting? Telecommuting, I'm not sure, I guess you could say it is taken off, sort of. But what comes after technological unemployment? There are certain things that humans are still very good at. And some of these crowdsourcing things tell us that those certain things that humans are still very good at is maybe much larger than we think compared to the machines, at least if the work is done in coordination with machines. But what we're really good at are isolated things. So you can kind of imagine a world or a civilization in which there are these sort of bright little sparks of human level intuition and creativity and insight that are separated by vast stretches of algorithmically accessible problems. And there's a lot of occupations and there's a lot of businesses where the successful insight on the part of management is figuring out how to do all the stuff that you can do without those expensive people. And then what remains are those bright little spots where you need to have the people. So technological unemployment, I think, is a very real thing. And in the early 20th century, the white-collar and academic sorts could kind of say grandly and with great objectivity that don't worry about the buggy whips no longer being something that can be sold. There will be other jobs that technology will create for you. I think their objectivity is cracking a little now that the tide of automation has risen to the point that more and more of their academic and white-collar jobs are also under that sort of pressure. Having a survival strategy for that sort of a world is one that might get us automatically into a situation where in the late teens that the average form of at least white-collar work throughout the world is actually to be participating in social networks or group minds that allows the enterprise to focus the humans on the things that the humans can really do and can do much better than any contemporary machine. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that in past years I kind of turned up my nose at the human thing, at least in the long run, because, as I said, biology doesn't have legs. On the other hand, I think it's true that at the present time, there is no program on Earth and no machine, computer that we've built that is of the intellectual caliber of a human being. Personally, I think that we will get that and we'll get things that are much better. But the present situation is we don't have anything like that. On the other hand, we already have an installed base of 7 billion human equivalent intelligences out there. And they're self-sustaining for the most part. That is really a remarkable resource. This talk could be regarded as talking about how to make that resource all that it can be for the benefit, actually turning it around, for the benefit of humanity. I think it actually has a wider importance than that, which I'll get to at the end of the discussion. I think I'm going to try to, let's see, that clock. Okay, so I'm going to try to get done and go to Q&A when I get in the vicinity of 9 p.m. here. The demography of the group. The demography of the group mind. You notice I say the demography is everything from 2 people up to 7 billion people. We've been talking, the last few minutes I've been talking about orders of billions of people. There actually are really cool things you could do with group minds that were size 2. For instance, when you get down to that small a size, I call them joint entities. There are all sorts of people who have very poor mobility, but have actually pretty good intellectual skills, perhaps of certain sorts. You also have people who have various sorts of deficiencies, but they also might have good mobility. Now, this sounds sort of, this is clearly, as with a lot of this technological stuff, a situation where things could go radically off the rails and produce something very evil. On the other hand, I see almost entirely good things coming out of having a situation where if you had one family member that was disabled and another family member that, say, couldn't speak French or had some other thing they couldn't do, having the two being able to work together. And with networks and with the communication we have now, that is certainly doable. So it seems to me that to the extent that medicine can't bridge the gap, that the internet and joint entities could actually make life better for a lot of people. So in all size ranges, I think there's reasons to talk about group minds. There's another category is the longevity of the group mind entity. There might be some group minds that essentially last as long as whatever they're doing makes sense technologically. I say that forever, that is 10 years or so. I could also see situations where the lifespan of the group mind might actually just be a few seconds. There's an example of a goal that I think we'd have to think about some more to imagine a situation where the setup and the takedown plus the actual goal would be something that would be just 10 or 15 seconds. But I think there probably are situations like that. The agility of the group mind is also something you could differentiate on. There might be some group minds that actually just work very, very slowly. They're working with economic statistics over a period of months. And of course, there might be others that are long-lived, but basically they're keeping an eye on everything. And there's obvious nasty versions of that. But there's also, I think, situations where being able to do that would be good. Forms of interactions with other group minds. This is actually something that would be important if we came to the point of having I don't know what the name for it would be, a sociology of networks or group mind designers. And I think you could make easy arguments that there are situations where you would want to have a group minds that you could deal with modularly for certain sorts of projects. And the interface between them would be interface design, like doing interfaces between modules, that you want a sort of narrowness of function so that you could actually put two of these group minds together and have one feed into the next one without having to get into a lot of other complexity. There would be other situations where that would be foolish, and you actually want interaction between all the members on the project, that you don't want to constrain it. This actually looks very much like software design, and I think it would be something that would come up if the overall idea of group minds had any traction. I think governance, for me as a science fiction writer, governance was really one of the most fun things to think about. We could imagine various forms of democracy. For a number of years, and still is the case, I have an idea in my idea box called Jim Jones on the Net, and that's the charismatic leader character. That sounds actually like a pretty nasty situation, but it's one that is imaginable to me. The commercial service group mind is one that seems to me the common case that we have now with social networks. You could have group minds that were secretly run by other group minds that actually were cell-structured. That sounds like a very political thing if you're trying to change, if you're out there undermining some sort of government. You could even imagine networks, social networks or group minds where the participants don't know that they are participating. And that actually has happened. I didn't put the URL here, but there was a story a couple years ago about an intelligence service that was getting face recognition on dissidents done covertly by crowdsourcing with a different cover story on the reason for the project. Other categories: how infectious it is, how fast it can spread. That's actually obviously of great commercial interest. How malignant it is. How much destruction is a thing doing? And you can imagine all sorts of bad things that might be doing. I think there'd be different group minds would have different sorts of weaknesses, and this gives a list, an obvious list that I think most of us already know. Some of them become more fearsome as technology goes on further. For instance, if you Google on the H+ trailer there at the end, there is a very scary situation involving wearable computers and widespread network failures. I want to talk about. So that was my look at a possible taxonomy for these group minds. I want to look at two particular types of group minds. There's a book that I recommend very highly, and that's Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which I think is really one of the most important nonfiction books of the last 10 years. So he is a fairly rare sort of a bird in that I believe he is a psychologist. Pardon? He's a psychologist. Right, but he got the Nobel Prize for economics. And studying how we think about making decisions. So Paul Sappho gave a talk here, I think last week, right? And I listened. I was kindly provided with the audio, and listening to the talk, he was talking about some of the things we know that people get wrong. And Kahneman, that's his whole thing. Is you could say it. The crazy, stupid things that people do. Only, really, and I think anybody who looks at this carefully agrees, we come from thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years of having to make fast decisions with very bad information to optimize having successful children. And that's a very different, making very fast life or death decisions where the information is very bad. It's not surprising that gives you a situation that you can sit in a room and I can sit in a room and chortle about all these, a failure to recognize regression toward the mean, all the sorts of oblivious things that people do. It's not because we're dumb. It's because we're optimized for a certain environment. And one thing that Kahneman talks about in several different points in the book is I would say from the standpoint of the economics people, the revolutionary thing about Kahneman was he said, you know all this stuff about the rational economic actor? People aren't like that. And the rational economic actor is sort of the central feature of classical economics. And if you read what he's saying in a little bit more, read down to the end of the paragraphs and read the whole chapter, he makes an interesting point, and that is, he calls rational economic actors econs as opposed to humans, which is what most of us are. There are people who behave a lot more like econs. And he makes the point that if you're in a situation to do something again and again and again, the rational econ approach actually does, in the long run, do better for you. The thing is, we as individuals do not have the horizon to do that. And if we've educated and trained ourselves and we've read a lot of history and read a lot of economics, we may actually do better, but it's still an enormous amount of effort, and it may get us into a real jam if we allow rationalism to push us into a corner where we've made some logical error. And that's a very interesting point. And I think one thing about the internet, which is already evident, is it does give you a baseline that is thousands or millions of times wider than the baseline that our ancestors even in agricultural civilizations, but certainly hunter-gatherer civilizations, the baseline that those folks had to make decisions. The internet actually does that. And social networks provided by, say, bottom-up group minds put us in a situation where you could actually be getting advice that would be on those longer baselines. So it would be like doing a little research on a search engine, which we all do nowadays, if you have to make some decision. But it would be much faster than that. So the result would be a kind of arbitrage of risk in personal decision making. And it could even be backed up by a sort of social insurance policy, and I don't mean that in the political sense. I just mean a voluntary social insurance policy run by the social network itself. All of this adds up to me is something that is coming down the pike and should be realized by institutions, and that is when you look at those 7 billion or even 200 or 300 million participants in all these different sorts of group minds, you are looking at an intellectual resource that totally dwarfs all the intellectual resources of the 20th century world and of the present world other than social networks. What sort of government can put together the gang of experts that can be collected in a well-designed group mind? Similarly, actually, for the sciences. So I think there's a real possibility and a certainty in certain segments that the group minds are something that is going to make a lot of our social organizations look relatively irrelevant, and that's something that something that's happening in the fairly near future, and in some ways it's happening even now. There are downsides to this. For instance, one could argue that it suppresses slow, thoughtful thinking about problems. It also has the potential for raising the problem of outsourcing ethical considerations, which is certainly a serious. Bruce Sterling does a terrific job with this sort of idea in a story he wrote called Maneki Neko, which deals with a type of, it's not clear whether it's a social network or whether there's higher AIs involved. There's also the question of what you do with non-participants, such as myself. And in thinking about the possibility of non-participants, probably everybody here thinks that really, there's some people who spent their whole life thinking about a problem. They really understand the problem more than, some group of people dragged in off the street, even though those people dragged in off the street would probably include some people who had thought about the problem quite a bit. So it might be interesting for the enthusiasts about the group mind idea to try to identify things that really, really could not be done by anything except a very, very talented individual thinking about the problem. Yes or no to that question is actually a very important fact. And I suspect that there are some where the group mind definitely trumps what you could do with your talented individual. Question is, what are the ones where having the talented individuals around is really absolutely essential? And then the follow-up question to that, if group minds are going to take off, is how do you deal with those individuals that you really need to remain independent? You still wanted to contract with them and to get results out of them, but having a protocol for that sort of work would be interesting. On the broadest scale, this actually looks like populisms, and I think in general it's a lot more benign than the populisms that we know about in the past, which have a very bad reputation in certain quarters. Ever since the 1950s, at least in science fiction, and I think more and more in the real world of government and social understanding, there has been the fear with technology that there's a certain number of people, actually quite a small minority of people in the world, who like to destroy things or who are so angry about things, at least sometimes, that they really want to destroy almost everything else. And technology makes that cheaper and cheaper for those people who want to break things. That actually is a driving and realistic fear, I think. And in a way, one of the biggest changes in my thinking about progress in the last 10 years is kind of been the astounded realization on my part that actually, if you look at large numbers of people who have the internet help them coordinate and are not breakers, the other type of people who are either neutral in the sense that they feel goodwill toward people close to them and they don't have bad will toward other people, that actually they have so much power that there is a chance that they can keep ahead of the breakers. And in a small, small way, Wikipedia illustrates that for me. If you had asked me in the year 2000 or the year 1995 about the idea of Wikipedia, I would have smiled sort of sadly and cynically and said, you just don't realize there are people who the very fact that that's a beautiful idea would lead them to destroy it. And certainly they would have the leverage to destroy it. I just wouldn't, I might not have been that strong about it, but I just said it's a wonderful dream, but I really think, there's this problem with it. And here we are in 2012, and, Wikipedia is an ongoing story. There may be some incredible apocalyptic scam that can be done with that sort of thing, but really, Wikipedia has done, on the whole, very, very well for itself. On balance, I think it's been an amazingly beneficial contribution to society. The whole thing with the social networks and the group minds has really increased my faith that we actually can prevail against the breakers, the extent of preventing them from blowing everything up. At the beginning of the talk, I did something I don't usually do, and that was all these different paths to the singularity. I said, this could really get us into a terrible bind. This could do these terrible things to the world, and so could this one. And this one may look safe, and it may look benign, say intelligence amplification, but I can tell you how that could go really bad too. In this digital Gaia thing, it could be even worse. I think at the same time of those 5 methods, the group minds are a very interesting case because they are something that exists to a certain extent right now, It can grow along with the technology. I think it is on balance very benign in its outlook. And it's the sort of thing that although I think in the long run it gets trumped by the other technologies, it's the sort of thing that will be humanity's method for guiding the other paths into something that, or it could be humanity's method for guiding the other paths into something that overall is a future that we may not be able to understand, but the late epoch group minds probably could understand and would be able to get us into a situation that has something that, at least on the scale, on the unintelligible scale that it plays out, would be regarded as a happy ending. So I think actually this particular path is especially important to present-day players. Thank you.
Elena, can we get a couple of folks to run mics for questions? And looks like people are already ready. I'll let you borrow mine.
Thank you. My name is Andre. Thank you very much for your talk, sir. I'm very interested in the different paths that you highlighted, and also, like you, usually unwilling to indulge in putting down ideas. But for this context, in this context, I'm German, and obviously we have our experience with populism. And in Norway, we've just had a very horrible sense of where the long tail can go wrong. So this is a new phenomenon, really, where people are grouping minds over borders, over long distances, and feeling, as part of a group, empowered to do horrible things. I feel like this concept could contribute to extending that further, which would be very dangerous to society. So my question to you is, how can we prevent that in governing these structures? How can we do that?
Right. I pointed to each of these paths to the singularity and commented how at least all the other ones could go terribly wrong. You have succeeded in pointing out how this one can go terribly wrong. It has the potential for being able to mellow all of the others, but it also has the potential that you just described. And I think there are some characteristics. For instance, virtual network partitions sound like an ideal breeding ground for the bad thing that you're talking about. In the virtual network partition that I see, and what you just finished saying is that even though these people are geographically separated, and even though they're potentially exposed to all sorts of points of view, in fact, they use the network only to see one point of view, namely the nutty point of view that they have bought into. So that sort of thing is something that is there, and preventing it being part of government policy would probably be a good idea, but that's not going to cure the sort of thing that you're talking about here. I suspect that the strongest thing is the fact that these people are outnumbered. That's the maker and the breaker thing, the balance. When we certainly hope that they are outnumbered, there is something much more dangerous, and that is when whole nation states undertake that sort of madness, where you remember or read about mutually assured destruction in the 20th century. When nation states get into that game, then it's not just a small number of breakers. It's millions and millions of the best people in the society are out there thinking about how to create non-survivable situations for their opponents. It's sort of a mutual suicide pact undertaken by not the breakers, but the makers. So that, by the way, that to me is the most dangerous thing that the human race faces, and it really doesn't have anything directly to do with the singularity. But I think you're right that the balance between the makers and the breakers is something that is really kind of a central focus in the sorts of threats that we face.
Pascal from London. You mentioned outsourcing moral responsibility in the group mind
I'm sorry,
situation. Outsourcing moral responsibility.
Oh, yeah, as a problem. I wasn't endorsing that.
Well, no, I just wondered whether, because it seems to me that actually the whole concept of nation states and the kind of divine right of kings and all those sorts of things are a kind of either taking away of moral responsibility or outsourcing already. And actually, for me, this sort of thing is about people being able to take back moral responsibility.
Yes, I like that. And in other words, I guess so. One response is outsourcing moral responsibility is something the human race is no stranger to. I mean, we're very happy. We've been very happy to do that. Many of us have been very happy to do that over the centuries, and this gives us the possibility of avoiding as much outsourcing of moral responsibility. Thank you.
The mic's over there.
Yeah. Hi. Is it on? Hey. Hi. My name is Federico. I'm from Italy, and I really liked how you touched on the technological unemployment part. When Jeremy Rifkin wrote The End of Work in 1995, lots of people ridiculed him, and very few people attempted to touch on a topic on a serious way. So the book I wrote, Robots Will Steal Your Job, but That's Okay, it's my attempt. And I'm very curious about how you think what transitional steps could or should happen to achieve a post-scarcity economy.
I will mention, by the way, he never misses a chance to plug the book.
Let me start out with a small disagreement in terminology, and that is a post-scarcity economy is certainly not a post-singularity idea. I think that the mind, the reach of the mind will always exceed its grasp. In other words, whatever is thinking will always be able to think of projects that are beyond what it can presently do. And that automatically gets you into a sort of a scarcity situation. So sometimes when I read utopias where everybody has everything they want, and that's the start-off assumption, that's something I disagree with. On the other hand, there is still the very valid point about what happens when large numbers of people, cannot economically compete with what they do, and that there is no alternative project on tap. And I don't call that, post-scarcity, but I think I see it as much of a problem as you see it. And I think we're actually, up until about 6 weeks ago, I was actually kind of in a tailspin about this issue, and then I started preparing this talk. And it occurred to me that we actually still have a lot of mileage left if you take advantage of the fact that we no longer have to have physical location involved in our work, and I mean that in a much stricter way than just telecommuting. And we no longer have to have any particular aspect of our attention and our logistics relationship with our physical logistics relationship is no longer important. At that point, the fact that there are all these billions of human-level intelligences out there is something that is very powerful, and if you're willing to work in that way, I think there is plenty of career left for any such person. That takes us a long way, and I think eventually I'm very much in favor of the IA stuff. I think eventually we will get into a situation where those people who prefer to work, in addition to having the social networking and the group mind stuff, will have real group minds, that is, where you have connections at the mind level and intelligence amplification. Let me say a little bit more about real group minds. In a real group mind, it's scary in its own way because you come face to face with issues of identity and self-awareness. But imagine, I'm going to get mystical here for a minute. Okay.
We already are a group mind.
Right. And that is that imagine that the human soul is like processes on not just a single machine operating system, but on a network. In that case, depending on the bandwidth and depending on the size of the problem, the size of the mind that is working on it changes. And in that sort of world, you'd have super intelligences for a few minutes, and then they would decrease perhaps into isolated intelligences if there was some reason for working in that way. So there are some very strange things that are going to happen in the latter era, and as we get into the singularity. And I don't claim to know what they are. What I just went through is just kind of some mind dreaming about how strange it could be. And I think there is full employment in situations like that, and our goal as present-day group minds is to make sure the full employment is entertaining to us.
Lena, do you have anyone back there with a... No, you haven't had the microphone? Okay.
So you've just basically laid out my secret long-term plan for my startup. So now that that's out in the open, I may as well ask you for some help. So, I kind of see crowdsourced predictive modeling as step one towards, a true group mind. And but in your talk, you kind of seem to be assuming at one point that you saw this as something that governments would be creating. Do you see...
I'm sorry, I said that governments would what?
I got the impression you felt that this kind of thing, that governments would be the things that would be creating or managing these things. Do you see them as something that could come out of an institution like that? And if so, any tips on the process that we might follow?
Actually, I don't think there's any reason why governments would have to be behind it. And let me sort of say it in a government, I'm saying that in a government neutral way, because I think there may be some people here who regard the governments as the main problem, and there's some people here who regard as government's the only organization with enough stability and maturity to undertake it. And I think actually these are projects that could be virtually emergent if they were done with free software and hardware of free design. So it'd be interesting to imagine this as a government project. In fact, I was telling Brad earlier that I'm trying to figure out the next novel. And one scenario for sort of an easy to read, easy to write post-singularity novel would be that very large AIs and very large systems. In other words, the current top 10 of the top 500. Right now, the current top of the top 500 in the U.S. is used a little bit to get some news items about AI, and then is turned over to reliability of aging nuclear weapons. Well, if somebody comes along with actual AI that can solve problems, one symptom you might see of that in the world that I just described is suddenly, when something new comes out in the top 500, it's not redirected after 6 months to doing something like some large numerical PDE. Instead, you see it disappear into the bureaucracy that made it as a decision-making element. And so imagine, this is my government scenario, imagine a world where the U.S. Department of State actually has a really nice machine. And so does the NSA. And so does NASA. And so do organizations in other countries that can make these things. And then imagine the notion that bureaucracies have a certain ethos. I don't mean ethics, I mean ethos. A certain, philosophy of life. I think the U.S. State Department has a certain philosophy of life. We might all disagree about what that is. I think the CIA also has a certain philosophy of life. And it'd be very interesting to imagine, and so does GM and IBM. It'd be interesting to imagine a world, this is not a group mind world, this is a pure AI world, very large machines in each of these organizations that is executing on the ethos and philosophy of that organization. In a way, it would be like a story about the Greek gods, although I hope a lot more responsible, since I think a lot of these organizations are, in certain senses, very responsible. And it would be interesting to see how they would operate. Suddenly, the conflicts, there's lots of spy stories about conflicts between DOD and State Department. Suddenly, those conflicts would be being played out at a very high level. And the players, that is, the bureaucrats in the organizations, it'd be pretty much perhaps like life was before, although they'd be much more difficult for them to tell exactly the why of the different policy directives that were coming down to them. This would not necessarily be a tragic and cataclysmic world, because these players would want their machines to stay intact. And so actually that's a story that I've been thinking about.
They could just revoke its certificates, right?
Yes.
All right.
Thanks. My question is, what strikes you most about today when you compare it with the future you imagined when you started writing science fiction a couple of decades ago?
My hearing is really bad, so the first part of that question I couldn't hear.
What strikes you the most about today, the present day, when you compare it with the future you imagined 20, 30 years ago?
For many years, it was embarrassing to me that I would get that question and say, you know, I don't know. There hasn't been a damn thing that's changed about the way I look at these questions, which is sort of typical what you expect of somebody who would ossify, you know, somewhere around 1995. Actually, I do see some that there have been some differences in my attitude, and some of them I've tried to say here today. For instance, my faith in the makers over the breakers. I've always had that as a wish. And now it's something that I think I can realistically be optimistic about, although I could still obviously be very wrong about that optimism. So that actually is a significant thing. The power of some of these crowdsourcing things was very extraordinarily impressive to me. Those are a couple of. If I thought a little bit more, I think there are 5 or 6 fairly significant things that have changed. But
and I also just heard you say nice things about government, so that's a change of heart. Now, Vernor wrote a story called The Ungoverned, which is considered one of the classic works of anarcho-capitalist philosophy in a science fiction story. So if you're interested in that, I recommend you look that story up. We have some mics over there.
Hi there, Sebastian from Sweden. So earlier today we were talking, with Dan Barry, we were talking about consciousness in AI and robots and stuff. What's your perspective on that in these different scenarios towards the singularity, that there will be consciousness within the general AI? And then what are the risks if that happens? Maybe they would become the breakers.
I don't see any reason why the things we call consciousness cannot exist on other substrates. On the other hand, the specious power of Cyril's argument is that humans really have a hard time imagining that there is such hard time imagining self-awareness growing out of discrete steps. And I think one antidote to that is to actually look at what happens in your own head when you think about things and when you read things about neurotype stuff. I think we have a very great need to have in ourselves to have the notion of a coherent global self-awareness. By global, I don't mean the whole world. I mean stretching from here to here. The notion of global self-awareness is really important, and this shows up in people who have various sorts of pathologies that they really are interested in pretending that they are all there. There are people with chronic memory deficits that can't remember more than 3 or 4 minutes in the past. And those people actually work very hard to dissemble about that fact. I have a friend who, when he gets drunk, he doesn't acknowledge to himself that he is drunk. He feels as though, he tells me that he feels as though he's pretending to clown around, like he's drunk. Simultaneity, for instance, you don't have to do very many experiments to realize that what you insist on regarding as a particular moment where something happens is actually spread out across maybe even several hundred milliseconds. The obvious and famous example of that is the reflex arc when you touch a hot stove. That brings it home very rapidly that there are multiple decision indicators working. So I think actually we have a great need for the notion of self-awareness, but it is not nearly as clear-cut as we might like to think. There's also the question, and that is there a optimum band for self-awareness? In other words, if something is very large, if a mind is very large, especially if there's latency issues of more than a couple hundred milliseconds, say latency of 10 seconds, is there much point to the notion of global self-awareness? So it is conceivable, and I don't think this is true, but it is conceivable that we will discover that there is this band, roughly a human band of mental competence where self-awareness lives. And outside of that, or at least above that, there is no special interest in it. Bruce Sterling did a terrific story on that about a critter that was very, very competent. And at one point, it's dealing with an individual human, and it says, you know, most of the time there is no need for self-awareness. It's a frippery. It's an unnecessary thing. But dealing with you, I'm going to evoke one for a few minutes.
You had a mic at the back there?
Yes. Stefania from Romania, you mentioned Foldit, and actually the Foldit players, the first 2 years, they won a competition between the scientists studying the enzymes. That was very interesting, but the third year, they lost the competition. And what's interesting to see is that after a while, they weren't so efficient at playing the game and finding new models. So basically, the roads in their mind at some point became highways. So how do you envision this group mind adaptation from one field to another, from a micro-expertise to another micro-expertise? Thank you.
Again, I have to plead partial deafness.
So she was talking about how the teams in the Foldit project did very well the first 2 years. In the third year, they started losing some of that ability. I'm trying to remember exactly the sum of what you said, but what was your metaphor? Highways and...
After a while, their ideas, they became stronger and stronger, so they were reluctant to find and try new ideas.
Oh, so they stagnated. Their group mind stagnated. And how do you see going around that?
Actually, I think the stagnation of group minds on a problem is probably a place where you want to bring in your group mind designer. This is actually something that does not happen automatically just because you get a bunch of people talking over the internet. That they're and this is something I think could be very interesting to some of the people here. That as with software engineering, there are design principles here that partake both of classical human psychology, you're dealing with humans, and constructing the software that makes them happy to still cooperate and then provokes or disprovokes the sort of behavior that makes things worse. The case of Foldit would be very interesting to follow further. At dinner, I was talking to someone, Jeffrey, who actually knows the Foldit person, Jeremy Holland.
Yeah, no, he asked you a question. It was the gentleman who said that you revealed his
business plan. And in this conversation that I had with him at dinner, he said that they actually, in some of those crowdsourcing, another big surprise was that it turned out that there were just individuals that were not supernaturally, but were extraordinarily good. And in some cases, I think there are cases where it's just totally intuitive. In other cases, the person who was so good could tell you how he did it. And the fact that there is crowdsourcing like that, in those particular projects, my interlocutor out there at dinner said they took those algorithms and they put them into the computer algorithm that was being used by the system. So your statement that their success leveled off, I don't know, but conceivably it's because they were playing against an automatic opponent that had benefited from their insight in the earlier rounds. And in the long run, I hope that there are still some rounds of human superiority left in Foldit. In the long run, I am astounded at the outset that humans can fold proteins better than, can fold amino acid strings better than 2012 programs can.
All right, how about this side of the room? Who's got, please, you were all eager a minute ago. All right,
Over here?
We'll move over there. All right, great.
Hi, Libby from Wisconsin. I think this summer we're tasked with tackling some of these global grand challenges, and I'm curious what you think the role of fiction can be in tackling some of these problems that we have today.
Fiction, in this case science fiction, I think has two big things to contribute. One is it's a form of scenario-based planning, and I think scenario-based planning is actually in the present era, scenario-based planning is really the most important type of planning. And you guys do have workshops about scenario-based planning, right?
Absolutely.
How different would you say your approach is from, say, GBN?
Who wants to answer that?
I just ask because it's the sort of thing I understand, then we're on the same page and I can talk about it. I just think scenario-based planning is super cool and super important if things are really as uncertain as what we are facing up to. It gives you a system of symptoms you can watch for. It allows planning with regard to those symptoms. So that is super good. Now, science fiction, and obviously I have a special interest here because science fiction writing is very much like scenarios. Science fiction has one enormous advantage for most users, readers, compared to scenario-based planning, and that is if you can write a story that engages the emotions of the reader. And if suppose the reader is a specialist who has an IQ of 185, then it doesn't matter that you, the science fiction writer, have an IQ of 125 and know very, very little about what you are talking about. If you can entangle that 185 IQ specialist emotionally in the story, you can then parasite off his brain and make him do the heavy lifting to make your broad stroke baffle gab actually turn out to be something that can be done in the real world, or a description of something that could exist in the real world. That is actually a very powerful and I think underappreciated situation about science fiction. So in the first part, I think if I were a serious, planner and not a science fiction writer, I would be very interested in scenario-based planning. I think if you are doing scenario-based planning, if you find science fiction writers who write in the general area and are the same general subject area and are congenial, then having one of them at your scenario-based planning meetings as sort of a loose cannon actually does a lot of good, because it will shake up if you do scenario-based planning, serious with committees and stuff like that, you're going to have people who are not sold on the idea. And if they are sold on the idea, they're not willing to get out of the narrow one-way thing that is going to happen by their feeling about what the future is going to be like. And the loose cannon can tend to break that up if the loose cannon is carefully chosen.
So I think you're underselling your profession, actually, because I think that you and many other science fiction writers have presented certain ideas to vastly greater numbers of the public than would have presented them by, say, the essayists in the field and the people who might claim to be the top actual experts. Some of the concepts that are in Rainbow's End and various other novels of yours have seen a larger audience because of your way to present them and make them entertaining to people. So don't sell that short.
Right, but I don't think that's terribly in disagreement with what I said.
No, not in disagreement. I wanted to add to it. All right, back there.
One of the most exciting ideas in the near future is this idea that you've got billions of human-level intelligences coming online. And it's something you seem to be very excited about. But one of the problems with that is not all human-level intelligences are created equal. And one of the things that you discuss is your belief that we can have full employment, but empirically what we see happening is that in much of the Western world, people are finding themselves competing with both algorithms and the Chinese, and they're not willing to sacrifice or work at the level which would be profitable for them to work. And so in effect, we have a situation where we actually have less and less of a full employment economy. And I I was wondering what your take on that is going forward.
Well, I think that, especially if things work out in a mellow way, that there will be significant number of people who choose to be consumers but non-participants, and that the people who make things and the automation that makes things will be plenty powerful enough to satisfy, those consumer desires. About 5 or 6 years ago, I gave a talk at a corporate research center about this size audience, probably about this, very talented people, about, comparable to here. And one person raised his hand. He says, "Okay, this is all very nice. I wasn't giving exactly this talk, but someplace I brought up the notion of the internet as a test bed for group enterprise involving large numbers of people." And he said, "But the average person, do you really think that they have either the motivation or the talent to be of use?" And I think I can give a somewhat better answer now than I did in that case. The short answer is yes. But, and then caveats, I think the vast majority of people are, I think it was Voltaire who said, the average person, he wants to cultivate the garden, they're interested in their friends and their family, and they don't want somebody to come around and blow it all away. That still is a human level intelligence. If, for instance, it turns out that sort of employment, the group mind or social network sort of employment is still something that can pay them money, they might very well be willing to donate their human level of intelligence to participating in social networks to solve problems and get money for it. Then also, if you look at just sort of the demography that this is intuition now, off the top of my head, that I sort of see in the contributors to Wikipedia, I think that there is an enormous number of people, perhaps still a small minority compared to the total human population, but there's an enormous number of people who have intellectual interests of a certain sort in a certain thing and have certain sorts of talents in dealing with that. And they really think it's cool to be able to, to work with that and get that out to where it can be used. So in addition to the fact that the internet allows us to reach, probably there are 1,000 people in the world right now that are smarter than Einstein. 100 people? Okay. There's actually more than one, I think a number. They can be reached. And if we get large numbers of people that are moderately, comfortable in their lives, the fact is that this is very likely going to be the sustainable form of employment for the next 15 or 20 years. I think gives them plenty of encouragement to do something that otherwise is very pleasurable for them to begin with. So I do think that they're really, that the human race as a whole has these segments that can be, that can happily participate in doing very clever things.
All right, so we're going to get to the wine soon, but we'll do just one or two more perhaps, and then, okay, we've got one back there, sorry, he was already in line first.
Thank you so much. I think I speak for a lot of people here when I say that talk was one of the most mind-blowing things that we have heard. And I think what part of the mind-blowingness comes from your giving a name and a phenomenon to a trend that we have observed. And we have lacked to see the overall picture. And just briefly, two things that you mentioned, I just read specific test cases for. One is the group mind coming together for 2 seconds and disbanding. And that happens in crowdsourced crimes.
In crowdsourced what?
Crowdsourced crimes. So individual muggers who are too afraid to commit a crime say, okay, let's get all together.
Right.
And then, disband after 2 minutes. We don't know each other. And then again, for puppetry, about other people who are involuntary acting, they too, there was a recent thing about the Craigslist ad where they asked people to dress in hard hats and construction gear outside a bank. And then a robber walked out in a construction hat, hard hat, bank. And
you have a
away.
dark mind.
But on the flip side, I'm also a student of population genetics. And from that perspective, we see a trend in biology that gives a name to what you've been saying. It's called quasi-species theory. So
What theory?
Quasi-species theory. And this idea that when you have a large population that's evolving, instead of having individual organisms that evolve and die, you have an entire net, which is like the giant cloud that has similarly interconnected sort of mutations, and that exists and evolves as a whole.
Right.
And that's much more robust and much more intelligent.
Right.
But my question to you, sorry for long-windedness, is also in population genetics, you see this thing about diversity. And I think part of the human capital, human creative capital, is having a multitude of perspectives where if you have a group mind and the group mind has a very strong ethos, you sort of like subsume all individual perspectives to that group mind. And the people who actually remain outside group mind offer sort of creative sparks of human intelligence that might outshine people who are thinking in concert with each other.
I agree with that. On the other hand, thinking ahead to the specialty of systems engineering for group minds, those system engineers, I think, one of their fundamental principles would be what you just said, and using the automation to engage those outliers would actually be, and enable those outliers would be part of their scheme. Now, depending on if the outliers they are dealing with are hardy individualists, it might not be apparent to those outliers that they were actually part of the scheme. But if you could imagine a systems engineer for such a creature putting together something that takes into account that they want to use the outliers.